The fluorescent lights hummed above Oak Creek Memorial's ICU like a swarm of insects trapped in plastic. Megan O'Brien moved through the ward at 6:36 a.m., before the shifts changed, before the noise started, before anyone paid attention to the quiet nurse in navy scrubs who knew exactly what she was doing. Her hands moved from patient to patient with the precision of someone who had sutured wounds under mortar fire, checked vitals in field hospitals where the power died every fourth day, held compression on femoral bleeds while helicopters screamed overhead. Here, at a civilian hospital in Norfolk, those hands were just hands. Competent. Invisible. Exactly how she needed them. She had been at Oak Creek for 6 months. 178 days of methodical charting, of catching medication errors before they reached the pharmacy, of noting pharmaceutical discrepancies that didn't add up, orders that arrived in quantities that made no sense, billing codes that didn't match supplies, inventory logs that had gaps the size of trucks. She wrote it all down, every detail, because that was what you did when you couldn't be casual about anything anymore. When you'd seen what happened when someone wasn't paying attention. She documented everything in a neat, compact script that took up half a page per patient where most nurses used 2 lines. Her notes were so thorough that the attending physicians had stopped asking questions and started just reading them instead. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and something else underneath, the faint copper of blood from the trauma bay 3 doors down, the bitter chemical tang of air recycled through industrial filters. Megan didn't flinch at it. The smell was clean. It was honest. It told you what was happening without lying. She checked the 4-on bed for a post-surgical patient recovering from a routine hernia repair, stable, boring, exactly the kind of case that let her mind run in circles. She'd spent 12 years knowing how to handle the opposite of boring. 12 years as Senior Chief Petty Officer with the Naval Medical Corps, attached to field surgical teams that moved through Iraq and Afghanistan with the rhythm of a heartbeat. She'd trained with the 5th Marine Regiment out of Camp Lejeune, served 2 tours in Ramadi when the clinic got bombed and they had to set up in a concrete basement with a generator and hope. She'd learned to suture while artillery rolled in the distance, to triage when the waiting room looked like something out of a nightmare, to keep her hand steady when everything was falling apart. That was before the PTSD became something she couldn't swallow down anymore. Before the nightmares started stacking on top of each other until she couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't walk into a room without scanning for exits. Before she'd sat in the Naval Hospital San Diego office of a psychiatrist with kind eyes who'd said the words that changed everything, "You don't have to keep doing this. You've already given enough." So she'd signed the paperwork, walked away from the uniform, disappeared into civilian life like a submarine sinking into deep water. No forwarding address. No contact information. Just Megan O'Brien, RN, no rank, no unit, no medals, no stories. A ghost in scrubs who happened to be extraordinarily good at her job. Her locker held exactly 3 personal items. A change of shoes. A faded unit patch from the 5th Marine Regiment sewn into the inside lining of her jacket, invisible unless you knew to look. And a single photograph of a medical evacuation helicopter against a dust-choked sky, the date written on the back in fading ink, Ramadi, 2009. She never looked at the photograph. She only kept it to remember why she'd left, why she couldn't stay, why she had to be nobody here. Dr. Sterling arrived at 7:15 a.m., right on schedule, his shoes clicking against the tile in a rhythm that belonged to someone who had never waited for anything in his life. His shoes cost more than most people's car payments, Italian leather, probably $1,600, maybe more. He wore them over a pair of socks that were definitely silk. Everything about him screamed privilege and the particular brand of arrogance that came from never being told no. His jacket was tailored so precisely that it looked like it had been painted onto his shoulders. His watch was a gold Rolex, the kind of thing that made a statement about exactly how little he cared about subtlety. Megan had learned in 6 months of careful observation that Dr. Sterling had a very specific way of moving through his day. He arrived early, before the attending physicians, before most of the nursing staff was fully conscious. He moved through the ICU like someone inspecting inventory, clipboard held against his chest, eyes sharp and calculating. She had noted with the precision of someone trained to notice details that could kill you, extraordinarily good at his job. He knew every patient's history, every medication interaction, every possible complication. He was the kind of doctor who would have been brilliant if he was also the kind of doctor who gave a single damn about the people he treated. She had noticed something else in the past month. The pharmaceutical orders didn't match the billing. The narcotic counts were off by quantities that seemed random until you looked at them in sequence. Then they made a perfect, terrible pattern. Someone was ordering oxycodone in quantities that should have gone to end-of-life palliative care, but the patients died on different schedules than the supplies arrived. Someone was ordering vancomycin at rates that didn't match infection rates across the hospital. Someone was taking supplies and replacing the paperwork, and doing it carefully enough that nobody noticed except for the one nurse who documented everything because documentation had kept her alive in places where nobody was coming to save you. She had reported it. Quietly. Through the proper channels. She'd submitted it all to the pharmacy director 3 weeks ago, a neat stack of copies, color-coded, cross-referenced, impossible to ignore. The director had looked at her like she'd walked in speaking Farsi. He'd thanked her, told her he'd look into it, and she'd known immediately that nothing would happen. That was when she understood the shape of what was really going on here. Dr. Sterling stopped at the nurse's station while Megan was updating patient charts. She was sitting at the desk with her back to him, fingers moving across the keyboard in short, efficient strokes, recording medication times, for flow rates, urine output, pain assessments, the kind of granular detail that mattered to people who cared about precision. She didn't turn around. She knew he was there. You could feel a presence like that. You could feel when someone had decided they owned the space you occupied. He set his clipboard down on the desk with a soft click and pulled her most recent chart toward him. His eyes moved across her notes with the speed of someone who could read in photographs. She saw his jaw tighten. His fingers curled against the edge of the clipboard. He flipped to the next page. His breathing changed, a single sharp intake of air through his nose, like he'd just tasted something bitter. He read all 4 pages of her pharmaceutical documentation, the careful cross-references, the dates and times and quantities that added up to something nobody was supposed to notice. She could hear his breathing. She could hear the hiss of fabric as his hands clenched. Then he closed the chart, set it back down in front of her, and walked away. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the ventilators in the corner room, the soft beep of a cardiac monitor 2 beds down, the air conditioning system cycling through another round of recycled breaths. Megan kept typing. She didn't turn around. She didn't let her hands shake. Muscle memory had taught her how to do that, how to keep going when someone had just recognized you as a threat. How to move through the world like you didn't understand that you'd just changed the equation. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 3 minutes later when she heard Dr. Sterling's voice in the hallway outside, and then the sound of his footsteps moving toward the elevator, and she understood with absolute clarity that he'd just made a decision about what to do with her. Colonel Marcus Hayes arrived in the ambulance bay at 8:41 a.m. with shrapnel wounds from Ramadi, specifically from a convoy ambush along Route Michigan, the driver explained as they wheeled him through, moving fast, his uniform still covered in desert dust, his eyes alert even though his left leg was bleeding through 3 layers of field dressing. He was conscious, competent, the kind of green beret who didn't waste energy on pain because pain was information and information was survival. The trauma team took him to Bay 3. The attending surgeon, Dr. Chen, called for hands on deck. Megan was there before the announcement finished. She was moving suture materials, setting up the overhead lights, establishing the sterile field with a kind of efficiency that made it look simple. She had her hands gloved in 17 seconds. The instruments were arranged before Dr. Chen asked for them. The first suture was ready when the scalpel started moving. The shrapnel had come through the soft tissue of his left shoulder, had missed the axillary artery by maybe 3 millimeters, which meant he was alive by accident or luck or divine intervention, depending on what you believed. It meant he needed someone who understood closure patterns that could hold against the inevitable infection, against the way wounds in combat zones got complicated by exposure. It meant he needed someone who knew that you didn't just close a wound. You built architecture. Megan began the 3-layer combat stitch pattern without being asked, muscle memory taking over, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this in basements and tents and ambulances surrounded by the sound of incoming fire. Subcutaneous layer first, the absorbable suture going in with consistent tension, creating a foundation that would hold when the swelling went down. Then the dermis, the meticulous cross-hatching that a civilian surgeon would take 45 minutes to execute, her hands working with such practiced speed that it looked like choreography. Finally the epidermis, the running subcuticular pattern that left no visible knots, just a line that would heal into something almost invisible. Dr. Chen was watching her hands like he was trying to solve a puzzle. His mouth had gone slightly slack. When she reached the final sutures, he finally spoke. Not to her. To the patient. Hayes. You know this nurse. Colonel Hayes turned his head just enough to see her face, and she watched the moment of recognition happen. The way his eyes went sharp. The way his breathing changed. The way the whole room suddenly felt smaller. He opened his mouth to speak, but Megan reached down, pressed one finger gently against her lips, and kept working. The message was simple. Don't. Hayes closed his mouth. He understood. You could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way his eyes flicked back to the ceiling. He understood that some people earned their anonymity the hard way, and you didn't blow that for them. She finished the last suture in silence and stepped back. The wound was closed. The bleeding had stopped. The architecture would hold. And nobody in that trauma bay except Colonel Marcus Hayes had any idea that they'd just watched a senior chief petty officer from the Naval Medical Corps, someone whose hands had put together 4,000 lives in places where the power died and the generators smelled like diesel and the only light came from flares and muzzle flashes, disappear back into invisibility. She didn't flinch when she pulled off the gloves. She didn't acknowledge the moment. She simply turned and walked out of the bay, her hands already reaching for the antiseptic dispenser, ready to move on to the next patient, the next shift, the next day of being nobody in a city where she'd come to disappear. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent hum on the morning of day 6. 20 nursing staff members crammed around tables scarred with pen marks and old coffee rings, their voices layering over each other in the particular chaos of shift change. Dr. Sterling leaned against the counter near the sink, his tailored coat unbuttoned just enough to show the expensive watch beneath his cuff. His presence occupied space the way some men's voices do, not through volume, but through the certainty that everyone would listen. I'm making a public prediction, he announced, his tone carrying the casual confidence of a man who'd never been wrong about anything that mattered. 20 heads turned. Our newest nurse won't last the week. Anyone want to take that bet? Laughter rippled through the room like a wave. Someone said something about nursing school washouts. Another voice offered odds. The conversation rolled forward, the kind of easy cruelty that happens when a crowd realizes the target isn't present to hear it. Megan stood in the doorway, lunch bag in hand. She'd been 5 seconds away from entering before Sterling spoke. She remained motionless, listening to the prediction settle over the room like sediment. 1 measured breath. 2. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. She simply absorbed the words the way desert absorbs rain, completely, without resistance. She stepped into the break room. The laughter died. Not quickly. In stages. Someone noticed her first, nudged a neighbor, and the awareness spread like dominoes falling in slow motion. Sterling didn't look up. He was checking his phone with the studied indifference of a man who hadn't miscalculated anything and never would. The silence stretched until it had weight. Megan opened the refrigerator and placed her lunch bag on the second shelf, right beside a yogurt container that had probably been there since March. She closed the door. Turned. Met Sterling's eyes directly across the 12 feet of linoleum between them. A single tear escaped her left eye. Just one. Biological response to adrenaline, nothing more. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, the motion deliberate and controlled. Her voice came out pitched like still water, flat, clear, terrifyingly calm. I've been called worse by better men, Doctor. She walked past him toward the exit. The room had gone completely silent. Even the refrigerator's compressor seemed to hold its breath. Sterling's phone hand had stopped moving. His face had shifted from indifference to something sharper, his jaw tightening at the edges. No one had ever responded to his predictions. That was the structure that made them work. The target either quit or stayed quiet, both options validating his assessment. Megan had done neither. 2 days later, the cafeteria during lunch rush was a collision of sound and motion. Trays clattering. Conversations echoing off tile walls in an overlapping wash that made the space feel cramped despite the high ceilings. The smell of steamed vegetables mixed with chicken broth and something burnt from the grill station. Megan moved through the crowd with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to navigating chaos, her lunch tray balanced on her left hand, turkey sandwich, side salad, black coffee. She passed Sterling's table near the window where he sat with 2 residents, his back angled toward the flow of traffic. He didn't look up from his conversation about a pharmaceutical rep's promised dinner reservations. His right foot extended into the pathway just as she passed. The tray went down. Not dropped. Went down like gravity had reasserted itself specifically against her. The sandwich scattered, salad spilling in a green arc across the beige tile, soup splattering across her scrubs in a pattern that would take bleach to remove. The coffee cup survived the fall and rolled under a nearby table, stopping against someone's shoe. Sterling didn't move. Didn't look back. Continued his sentence about the restaurant's wine list as if nothing had interrupted him. The room's volume decreased by half. A kind of collective intake of breath that people made when they'd witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. Megan knelt to begin collecting scattered silverware, her hands moving with absolute steadiness, each piece picked up and stacked with precision. A fork. A knife. The spoon. Someone moved toward her, one of the respiratory therapists, but she shook her head slightly. The gesture was small enough that only the nearest people saw it. They stopped moving. She picked up the tray, now empty except for the scattered debris of her lunch. Stood. Walked to the trash bin and disposed of what had been salvageable. Walked to the linen closet. Retrieved 3 paper towels and a damp cloth. Returned and cleaned the tile floor with the methodical care of someone who understood that visible damage had to be erased. The spill disappeared. The evidence vanished. By the time she finished, the only proof anything had happened was the soup stain across her scrubs, a spreading darkness like a shadow bleeding into fabric. She passed Sterling's table on her way out. He still didn't look up. For days accumulated like water behind a dam. Megan moved through the hospital corridors in a state of controlled vigilance, her medical instincts sharpened by the understanding that Sterling had just begun. She was right. On the 4th day, Sterling summoned her to the nurses' station during rounds. 6 medical students gathered there, 3 residents reviewing charts, attending physicians within earshot. The timing was specific. The location was specific. Everything about it was calculated. He pulled 3 patient charts from the rack. Her charts. Her documentation. He held them for exactly 2 seconds before releasing them. They fanned through the air and scattered across the floor at her feet, paper sliding in different directions, one chart coming to rest against the baseboard with a quiet whisper of movement. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His voice carried the tone of someone giving instructions to a junior staff member who'd forgotten the basics. "And try reading the orders this time, if that's not too complicated." The medical students looked down. One of the residents found something very interesting about his shoe. The attending physician made a point of examining her phone. The room had constructed itself into the perfect stage for humiliation, and Sterling had positioned himself as the director. Megan moved. Bent at the knees, not at the waist, a motion that suggested training, spine staying rigid. She retrieved the first chart, examined the papers briefly. Then the second. Then the third, which had slid the farthest. She straightened. The charts were now organized in her hands in chronological order. She met Sterling's eyes directly. Her voice came out pitched with the precision of someone answering a professional inquiry. "Which orders specifically concern you, Doctor?" Her tone suggested genuine curiosity, nothing defensive in the structure of the question. I can walk you through my clinical reasoning for each intervention." His face flushed. A visible heat spreading from his neck upward, the kind of response that came from losing control of a dynamic he'd assumed was firmly in his grip. The medical students exchanged glances. One of the residents made a note, not of her response, but of Sterling's reaction. That was the danger Sterling hadn't anticipated, that composure could function as armor, that refusal to break could transform humiliation into something else entirely. "That won't be necessary," he said, his voice dropping by half an octave. "Just ensure your documentation matches the orders going forward." He turned away. Dismissed her. But the dismissal arrived after he'd already lost the moment, and both of them understood it. That night, Megan sat alone in her car in the hospital parking lot, gripping the steering wheel. The parking lot stretched around her in rows of asphalt and sodium lights, the building's windows glowing against the Norfolk darkness. Her left hand had begun to tremor around hour 9 of her shift, a subtle vibration that ran from her forearm down through her fingers. The tremor had always come when stress intersected with suppression, when her body understood something her mind wasn't ready to process. She watched her hand shake against the wheel, then consciously steadied it. Her phone sat in the cup holder. The screen showed a number she'd saved 6 months ago, the VA hospital crisis line. Operators trained to recognize military distress. Counselors who specialized in the particular erosion that happened when former service members tried to rebuild themselves in civilian spaces. She pulled the number up. Let her thumb hover over the call button. The cursor blinked, waiting for her to choose forward or backward. Around her, the parking lot remained empty, the evening quiet broken only by the distant sound of an ambulance approaching Oak Creek Memorial from somewhere in the city. She sat with her hand hovering in the darkness, the phone's light illuminating her face, the same face that had maintained perfect composure through 4 days of calculated destruction, the same face that had learned not to break, not to cry, not to acknowledge damage. The ambulance got closer. Its siren cut across the night like a blade, and even in the parking lot, even with distance between her and the emergency bay, she heard the particular pitch that meant trauma, meant urgent, meant the hospital was about to transform into the kind of controlled chaos she'd actually trained for. She watched the ambulance lights paint the building red and white and red again. The tremor in her hand steadied completely. She set the phone down. Opened the car door. Stood. The evening air was cool and carried the particular smell of coastal Norfolk, salt mixed with diesel exhaust and something chemical from the industrial zone 2 miles west. She locked her car and walked toward the building, toward the emergency bay where lights were already beginning to concentrate, where the particular structure of crisis was unfolding. Her hand had stopped shaking. The monitors started screaming at 2:11 a.m. Megan was 2 floors down restocking trauma supplies when the first alarm cut through the hospital's dark breathing. She knew that sound. That particular frequency of electronic panic. Colonel Hayes. Her hands moved before her brain caught up, dropping the gauze packs back into the bin and accelerating toward the stairwell. The ICU doors swung open to a controlled storm, the nurses moving with purpose, the rapid-fire beeping of multiple monitors colliding in the artificial light, the smell of antiseptic mixing with something else. Something sharp. Adrenaline had a scent if you knew how to read it. The colonel's monitor showed the problem immediately. Megan's eyes traced the pattern like reading a familiar language. Sinus tachycardia climbing past 140. Blood pressure dropping in real time. 92/58. 89/54. Falling. The central monitor above his bed displayed what his body was screaming, distended neck veins, visible even from the doorway, his jugular column swollen like something was pressing against his chest from the inside. Muffled heart sounds. Pulsus paradoxus. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid was compressing his heart the way a hand closes around a fist. Megan was at his bedside before anyone else, her feet moving with the precision of muscle memory that transcended years. She didn't hesitate. She didn't assess. She knew. The colonel's eyes were wide, conscious, searching hers with the particular terror of a man whose body was betraying him in real time. His skin had gone pale, almost translucent under the monitor glow. His breathing came in shallow gasps. 30 seconds of observation. That was all it took. "I need help here," she said. Not loud. Calm as still water. The kind of calm that had kept 214 Marines breathing in a field hospital 12 kilometers outside Fallujah. A resident appeared at her shoulder, younger, still learning how to read crisis. "What are we looking at?" he asked. Megan was already moving to the supply cart, her hands reaching for the pericardiocentesis kit with the certainty of someone who had touched this equipment under conditions far worse than fluorescent hospital lighting. "Cardiac tamponade," she said. "Fluids crushing his heart. We drain it or he codes out." Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway like something summoned from the shadows. His hair was disheveled, his white coat buttoned wrong. He'd been sleeping. That detail registered and passed. He blinked at the monitors, at the colonel, at Megan already unwrapping equipment. His face rearranged itself into something resembling authority, but his eyes betrayed him. Calculation. Not concern. In that fraction of a second, something in Megan's chest went very still. "Where's cardiology?" Sterling asked. Not a question. A deflection. "ETA 18 minutes, a nurse responded. "Ambulance is backed up downtown." 18 minutes. The colonel had approximately 4. Megan was already positioning herself at the patient's bedside, her mind cataloguing the anatomy like she was reading a map she'd memorized in blood and dust. Subxiphoid approach. The needle would go in just below the xiphoid process, angled toward the left shoulder at 45 degrees. She had executed this procedure twice in a combat surgical hospital in Ramadi. Both times the alternative to success was zipping a body bag. Both times her hands had been steady. This time would be no different. "We need to wait for the specialist," Sterling said. His voice had changed. Cooler. There was something underneath it, something that sounded like relief that the colonel might not survive this moment. That sound made Megan's jaw tighten. She didn't pause. She reached for the chlorhexidine skin prep, the alcohol pad, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The room had gone very quiet except for the monitors. Rubber gloves snapped like gunshots as the resident beside her prepped the site. "Blood pressure is 76/42, the nurse called out. "He's losing it." Sterling stepped forward then. There was something in his posture that shifted, not to help, but to control. "Nurse O'Brien, stand down." "That's an order." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Megan didn't look at him. She was holding the pericardiocentesis needle, an 18 gauge, and her hands were rock steady. Rock steady the way hands get after you've learned that trembling kills people. That hesitation kills people. That doubt kills people. She had survived Ramadi by trusting the voice inside her that knew exactly what to do when everything was falling apart. "With respect, doctor, he has 4 minutes." Her voice came out level. Measured. The voice of someone stating fact, not opinion. She positioned the needle at the subxiphoid area, just below the xiphoid process. The resident's eyes were wide. The nurses had stopped moving, caught between protocol and the mathematics of mortality. Sterling's face had gone dark. Not pale. Dark. The kind of dark that happens when someone realizes they're losing control of a narrative. Megan inserted the needle at 45 degrees toward the left shoulder. Exactly like this. Exactly like she'd done it twice under mortar fire while rounds thudded into sandbags around her and someone was screaming her name. The angle mattered. The depth mattered. The confidence mattered. The needle advanced smoothly through the pericardial sac and met resistance, fluid, waiting. She attached the syringe. Drew back gently. Straw-colored fluid filled the chamber. The release was immediate. The monitors didn't wait for permission. The blood pressure monitor climbed like something awakening. 82/48. 89/54. 94/61. Climbing. The heart rate began its descent from 140. 128, 112. The colonel's eyes cleared, that particular look of a man whose body had just received permission to keep breathing. His chest expanded fully for the first time in minutes. The oxygen saturation rose in green digital numbers. 88, 91. 95, normal. The room exhaled together. Alarms quieted. The resident was still frozen. One of the nurses whispered something that sounded like a prayer. Megan continued drawing fluid with the precision of someone completing a familiar task. She didn't celebrate. She didn't look around. She had learned long ago that the moment you acknowledge victory is the moment you miss the next problem. She continued assessing the colonel's pupils. They responded to light now, sluggish but responsive. His skin was already warming. His breathing was stabilizing into something sustainable. The entire ICU had stopped moving except for her hands. Sterling stood in the doorway, his face absolutely white. Not the white of relief. The white of someone watching his calculations collapse. Watching her save the only witness who could corroborate anything about her identity. Watching her prove, in 4 minutes under fluorescent hospital lighting, exactly what kind of training lived underneath the scrubs. His expression shifted. The white drained into something darker. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved from the colonel to Megan, and what was in them then was something past anger. Something that looked like the recognition of a man who had just made a catastrophic strategic error. He had spent 6 months pushing her, testing her, betting she would break. And instead, she had just saved the life of a Green Beret colonel. She had just performed emergency surgery on instinct. She had just performed it perfectly. "Out," Sterling said. His voice was very quiet. "Now. Step away from that patient." Megan removed the needle with the same steady hands. She secured the fluid collection. She stepped back from the bedside. Around her, the residents moved in to continue care, to monitor, to document. She could feel Sterling's eyes on her back as she walked to the supply cart and disposed of the kit. As she peeled off her gloves. As she turned toward the ICU doors. The hallway beyond was empty except for the sound of her own footsteps on tile. She moved through the fluorescent light like someone walking through a photograph of her former life. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Everything about her was exactly as it should be. Which meant everything was about to fall apart. She could feel what came next the way you can feel weather approaching. Dr. Sterling wouldn't accept defeat. Men like Sterling didn't accept anything. They escalated. They weaponized. They called in favors from people with the same currency he had. And what Megan had just done, demonstrating not just competence, but expertise, not just training, but the kind of training that only came from a very specific background, was information he couldn't allow to exist in the hospital record. By morning, it would be documented that she had performed a procedure beyond her scope of practice. By noon, board members would be receiving calls from a physician with 17 years of reputation and a network of colleagues who owed him favors. By the end of the day, an investigator would be opening a file. She had just won a battle. But winning battles and surviving wars were two very different things. Megan pushed through the stairwell door and began walking down. Step after step. Her footsteps echoed in the concrete shaft like counting down to something inevitable. By dawn, the hospital corridors belonged to Dr. Sterling alone. He sat in his office with his door closed, phone pressed to his ear, voice measured and reasonable like a man discussing the weather. "Gerald, we have a liability issue." Board Chairman Gerald Watkins listened on the other end, a man who owed Sterling 3 referrals to his brother-in-law's private practice, a man who understood how favors worked in institutional ecosystems. A nurse performed an emergency pericardiocentesis last night without physician authorization. Scope of practice violation. Could expose us to significant liability. Sterling let the silence breathe. He knew how to plant seeds. He knew how to make risk feel personal. "I'm concerned about her judgment under pressure. We should get ahead of this." Watkins agreed before the call ended. By mid-morning, Sterling had moved through his contact list with surgical precision. He called Memorial Hospital in Richmond where Megan had worked before, Norfolk, spoke to the nurse manager there, another favor owed, another conversation about judgment concerns and protocol issues. He didn't lie. He simply emphasized the emergency procedure, the lack of physician orders, the risk she posed to future patients. Each reference became a small stone in a dam that would break silently. He called St. Vincent's in Virginia Beach. Same calibrated voice. Same careful language. I'm not saying she's incompetent. I'm saying she bypassed protocols when it mattered most. By noon, he had retained Patricia Chen, an outside investigator from the state licensing board who had worked with Sterling on 3 previous cases and understood the difference between documentation and truth. He handed her a folder thick with his notes, his interpretations, his concerns framed as objective observation. I need an independent review of the incident, he told her. For everyone's protection. Chen nodded. She was thorough. She was fair. She was also someone who had built her career on finding problems where people with institutional authority suggested they might exist. The machinery had been set in motion. Sterling had not yelled. He had not threatened. He had simply activated a network of people who understood that favor, debt, and professional concern operated on the same currency. He had transformed a medical emergency, one that he himself had frozen during, that he himself had been too terrified to manage, into a liability crisis. A problem to be managed. A nurse to be removed. 48 hours. That was all the system needed. The certified letter arrived at Megan's apartment on a Tuesday afternoon, the envelope bearing the state seal, the words "a nursing license suspension, pending investigation," printed in bureaucratic black ink. She read it twice. The language was surgical, pending review of alleged scope of practice violations, emergency procedures performed without physician authorization, potential risk to patient safety. Each phrase was technically accurate. Each phrase was also a knife made of rules and protocol and the assumption that a nurse who acted without permission was a nurse who could not be trusted. She didn't tremble. She didn't call anyone. She simply placed the letter on her kitchen table and waited for the next notification. It came at 3:08 p.m. the next day. Her badge no longer functioned. Oak Creek Memorial Security had disabled her access codes. She discovered this when she arrived for her shift out of habit, not remembering for a moment that she no longer had a shift, and the badge reader beeped a rejection that felt like a physical blow to the sternum. She turned around. She left. She drove home in silence. By change of shift, security arrived at her locker. Word had already spread through the unit, the way hospital news always spread, in whispers and meaningful glances and the careful avoidance of eye contact. 20 nurses watched as security supervisor Marcus Webb, a man she had treated with respect for 2 years, opened her locker and began placing her belongings into a cardboard box. Her water bottle. Her extra stethoscope. The faded unit patch sewn inside the lining of her jacket, the one she had carried through field hospitals and civilian waiting rooms, the one no one had ever asked about because no one ever looked close enough. Her shift change shoes. The box filled with the physical evidence of her erasure. Not a single nurse met her eyes as she passed them in the hallway. Not one. Dr. Sterling was waiting near the medication dispensary when she walked past. He didn't acknowledge her. He simply turned slightly, and she felt his gaze slide across her like a predator assessing whether prey was still moving. He smiled. Just barely. Just enough for her to understand that he had won. That afternoon, Megan sat in her apartment kitchen with the box of her belongings beside her and the suspension letter in front of her. The tremor had returned, not the controlled precision of surgical hands, but the deep, cellular trembling of someone who had lost structural support twice and was beginning to believe the ground itself was unreliable. She had walked away from the Navy because the weight of other people's trauma had become indistinguishable from her own. She had chosen anonymity in civilian nursing to heal in silence, to build an identity where no one needed her to be extraordinary. And now she had lost that too. The apartment felt smaller. The silence felt heavier. she drove to the Norfolk VA hospital as the sun was dropping toward the horizon. The automatic doors opened with a soft hiss. The waiting room smelled like strong coffee and floor wax, and something underneath, the accumulated scent of men and women carrying invisible weight, the smell of those who had seen things that changed the architecture of their brains. A Marine with a prosthetic leg sat reading a 6-month-old magazine. An army sergeant stared at the wall as if it contained answers. A sailor her own age rocked slightly, hands trembling in a way that told Megan exactly which deployment had broken him, which theater had burned out his nervous system. She recognized herself in every face. She sat down and pulled out the intake paperwork for PTSD therapy. The form was familiar, she had filled out versions of it hundreds of times, but always on behalf of someone else, always from the other side of clinical professionalism. Now the questions were pointed at her own geography of damage. How long had symptoms persisted? What triggered the episodes? Had you experienced combat-related trauma? She stared at that last question, pen hovering over the response box, and could not make herself write the word. Navy. Senior Chief. Service record. Medal citations. All of it too large to fit into a single word, all of it evidence of a person she had tried very hard to kill. She left the form incomplete and walked back to her car. The next morning arrived like a verdict. The sun cut through her apartment windows at an angle that suggested the world was continuing without her, that days would keep happening regardless of whether she was still part of them. She showered. She dressed in civilian clothes because there was no reason to wear scrubs anymore. She drove to Oak Creek Memorial not to work, but to sign termination paperwork with HR, to make official the fact of her absence. The hospital lobby was full of people moving with purpose. A man in civilian clothes arrived under State Department escort, 2 military personnel in dress uniforms flanking a man whose face carried the exhaustion of someone who had traveled a long distance from danger. Khalid Rahman. She would learn his name later. For now, she only saw a stranger being guided toward the cardiac unit by administrators who moved with the careful politeness reserved for international cases. She was filling out forms at the HR desk, watching the escort team disappear around the corner, when she heard the footsteps stop. When she heard the intake of breath that meant recognition. Khalid Rahman rounded the corner and saw her, and something in his face reorganized itself. The exhaustion fell away. His knees buckled. He collapsed forward, not with weakness but with the force of memory, and when he reached her, his hands were shaking as he seized hers and brought them to his forehead, to his lips, his voice breaking into Arabic and English both, Al-Malak al-Abayad. The White Angel. You saved my daughter in Ramadi when the clinic was bombed. You sewed her arm when the surgeons were overwhelmed. I never forget your face. Never. Megan tried to pull away. The impulse was instinctive, exposure, vulnerability, the mask she had constructed for 2 years fragmenting. But Khalid held her hands like they were the only solid thing in a world that had already taken too much, and the hallway was filling with people now. Nurses emerging from patient rooms. Doctors pausing mid-conversation. Security beginning to move forward, uncertain whether this was a medical emergency or a security situation. A young man in army fatigues pushed through the crowd. Captain David Hayes, whose father lay recovering in the ICU upstairs, whose father had coded and been saved by hands that now wore no badge, no credentials, no official permission. The captain studied Megan's face, then Khalid's, and something in his training, the same training that taught him to recognize rank by bearing and presence, made him understand exactly who she was. That Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien, he said. His voice carried across the hallway like a command, and the crowd stilled. The murmurs rippled outward. Security stopped moving. A nurse's hand went to her mouth. Someone whispered the rank aloud, testing how it sounded, Senior Chief. Colonel Marcus Hayes appeared in a wheelchair, his chest still bandaged beneath his hospital gown, pushed by a nurse who understood that he needed to witness whatever was happening here. His eyes found Megan immediately. Someone, perhaps the nurse, perhaps someone from HR, placed a folder in his hands. His personnel file. The redacted one. The one with blank spaces where her service record should have been, where her qualifications had been reduced to a single line, prior military experience. His hands trembled as he opened it. His eyes moved across the page. Navy Cross, he whispered. The word seemed to be not a question but a statement of fact, his voice turning it into something approaching a prayer. 2 bronze stars with Valor. Purple Heart. The hallway had gone completely silent. Then a man in Navy working uniform stepped through the crowd. Master Chief Richard Stone, SEAL Team 3, arrived for a veteran support group meeting, heard the commotion, recognized the woman standing at the center of it like she was a ghost that had walked directly out of his own memory. His voice when he spoke carried the weight of authority and witness. Camp Ramadi, 2009. 3-layer combat stitch. Senior Chief O'Brien held a field hospital for 72 hours under siege, performed 43 surgeries, lost 2 fingers to shrapnel and kept operating. He paused. The weight of that pause. She's the reason my team came home. Someone's phone clattered to the floor. 2 figures moved through the crowd in dark suits, their bearing unmistakable. Special Agents Morrison and Chen, FBI, badges catching the fluorescent light as they approached. Their eyes locked on Dr. Sterling, who had just arrived at the hospital for morning rounds and was standing frozen at the edge of the crowd, his face draining of color like someone watching his entire future collapse in real time. Dr. Sterling, Agent Morrison said, "We need to talk about your pharmaceutical supply agreement and the patents flagged in Senior Chief O'Brien's charting." Dr. Sterling opened his mouth. Closed it. Master Chief Stone stepped between them, not aggressively, simply definitively, and said 2 words that sounded like a prison door closing, "You're done." Megan stood perfectly still. The trembling in her hands had stopped. The room was moving around her, Khalid still kneeling, Colonel Hayes reading and rereading her name on official documentation, the crowd processing the dissolution of everything they had believed about rank and merit and whether the quiet people might actually be the ones holding everything together. A single tear escaped, and this time she didn't wipe it away. She simply let it fall, understanding finally that there was no shame in being seen, that invisibility had never been protection. It had only been another kind of wound. The morning light didn't penetrate the hallway the way it should have. Fluorescent tubes cast everything in institutional white, the kind of light that erases color and makes ghosts of living people. Megan stood at the nurse's station reviewing discharge paperwork when the elevator doors opened and a man stepped out who shouldn't have been there, who had no reason to be at Oak Creek Memorial in Norfolk on a Tuesday morning, but who moved toward her with the kind of certainty that made the nurses around her stop typing and turn. He was thin. His hands trembled as he walked. His eyes widened the moment he saw her face, recognition flooding through him like a current, and then he broke. Actually broke. His knees buckled and he caught himself against the wall and then he was on them, both knees against the cold tile, his hands reaching for hers. Khalid Rahman, former Iraqi translator, asylum-protected resident of the United States for 4 years, was sobbing in the middle of the hallway, and the sound he made was not in English. "Al-Malik al-Abayad," he choked out. You saved my daughter. Ramadi. The clinic was bombed and she was bleeding and his words fractured into Arabic and then back again. She's alive because of you. She's alive. The room went so quiet the fluorescent light seemed to hum louder. Megan's hands moved to help him up, her movements efficient and careful, and she caught the moment, the exact microsecond, when 3 different people realized simultaneously that they were standing next to someone who had done something that mattered. Really mattered. The kind of mattering that echoed across 14 years and 2 continents and made a man kneel in gratitude. Colonel Hayes had been discharged 2 hours earlier. He was supposed to be home resting. Instead, he'd driven back to Oak Creek Memorial with his son, Army Ranger Marcus Hayes Jr., who was built like a gate and carried himself like a man accustomed to doors opening when he approached them. The colonel walked into the hallway just as Khalid was being helped to his feet, and something in his face shifted, recognition meeting recognition, pieces clicking together with audible finality. "That Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien," Marcus Jr. said. Not a question. A statement delivered with the weight of certainty. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from leading men through impossible terrain, from making decisions where the margins between success and failure were measured in inches and heartbeats. The entire hallway heard it. The title hung in the air like a flare fired in darkness. Colonel Hayes moved to the nurse's station and pulled Megan's file. His hands trembled as he opened it. Trembled. She watched his eyes track across the pages, watched the moment he found what he was looking for, the notation buried in her personnel records, the one she'd never voluntarily disclosed, the one that had been logged the day she'd hired on as a civilian nurse. Navy Cross, he whispered. His voice cracked. 2 bronze stars. He looked at her with eyes that had seen war and recognized its signature. You came here to be invisible. The minute that followed was not normal hospital time. It stretched. A SEAL team leader, Captain Michael Stone, here for the veteran support group that met on Tuesday mornings, turned at the commotion and moved toward them with the fluid precision of a man for whom tactical awareness was muscle memory. He didn't ask for confirmation. He simply began reading her decorations aloud, each one an echo of choices made in sand and smoke. Bronze Star, 2009, Helmand Province. His voice was steady. Respectful. Bronze Star, 2011, Kandahar Province. And the Navy Cross. Distinguished conduct under fire. Multiple casualties, high-risk evacuation, surgical intervention under direct enemy engagement. He paused. You're a legend, Senior Chief. You know that. And then the doors to Oak Creek Memorial's main entrance opened and 2 men in dark suits moved through them with the unhurried confidence of people who had already decided how the next conversation would go. FBI. The kind of presence that made ordinary hallway conversation stop mid-sentence. They walked directly to Dr. Sterling's office, and what followed was not the sound of negotiation but the sound of institutional power structures shifting like continental plates. Later, much later, when the details became clear, the narrative unspooled like this: the senior chief's flagged pharmaceutical discrepancy charts had triggered something larger than hospital administration could contain. The charts themselves were evidence. Federal evidence. Evidence of systematic fraud, evidence of kickback schemes worth $417,000 over 18 months, evidence so thoroughly documented that it had crossed from hospital audit into criminal investigation territory the moment it was digitally flagged. Dr. Sterling sat in an FBI interview room. His attorney sat beside him, whispering words that didn't matter because the photographs on the table were saying everything. Bank records. Email threads. Pharmaceutical contracts. The meticulous work of a nurse so thorough in her documentation that she had essentially built the prosecution's case without ever knowing she was doing it. What Dr. Sterling didn't know, what he was learning right now, in real time, in a room that smelled like coffee and fluorescent lights and the copper taste of his own career ending, was that backup existed. Insurance. The kind of insurance that only comes from someone who understands consequence. Tommy Vasquez, the IT administrator for Oak Creek Memorial, was a Marine Corps veteran with 12 years of service and the kind of technical precision that came from having maintained computer systems in forward operating bases where every byte of data could mean the difference between an ambush prevented and an ambush that killed. When Dr. Sterling had called him that morning, when Sterling had requested, then demanded, then begged for security footage to be deleted, Tommy had listened and said the words that every IT administrator says when they're about to save evidence instead of destroying it. Sure thing, document. I'll take care of it. And he had. He'd taken care of it so thoroughly that 3 separate copies of every security frame now existed in 3 separate places. He documented every moment, Sterling knocking the cafeteria tray to the floor. Sterling throwing patient charts at Megan's feet. Sterling making his public bet in the break room, voice carrying that particular tone of cruelty that people used when they thought there were no consequences coming. Tommy had walked into the FBI field office himself, handed over an external drive, and said, "This is everything you need." This is what he did to her. The hospital board meeting happened within 72 hours. Chairman Watkins received the security footage on a tablet. He watched his own phone records being pulled, the 6 a.m. call he'd made to Dr. Sterling, the one where Sterling had requested that he use his influence to protect the fraud investigation. Watkins's resignation was effective immediately. Dr. Sterling's medical license was suspended that same afternoon. Riverside Pharmaceuticals CEO was arrested by federal agents before dinner. Megan's nursing license was reinstated with a formal written apology. The apology was lengthy. It acknowledged systemic failure. It acknowledged retaliation. It acknowledged that she had performed an emergency procedure that had saved a man's life, and that the response to heroism had been destruction. 6 months passed. Time moved at its normal rate, which is to say that it moved forward, and life continued, and the world kept rotating on its axis, indifferent to justice and consequences and the small victories of people who had learned to survive impossible things. The ceremony was at the Pentagon. Colonel Marcus Hayes stood at a podium flanked by flags, and he read a citation aloud in the kind of voice that came from decades of command. Megan sat in the front row wearing her restored Oak Creek Memorial nurse's uniform. The faded unit patch was visible now, no longer hidden inside jacket lining, but sewn openly on her shoulder where anyone could see it and understand what it meant. For extraordinary heroism and selfless service both in combat and in continuing to save lives despite personal cost, the colonel read. His son stood beside him. Master Chief Stone stood at parade rest. Khalid Rahman sat in the third row with his daughter, now 14, now healthy, both of them crying. Tommy Vasquez sat in his marine dress blues, wearing them for the first time in 4 years, and he saluted when Megan approached the podium. The hospital CEO announced a new policy named in her honor, the O'Brien Protocol, designed to protect medical professionals who acted in life-threatening emergencies without waiting for bureaucratic authorization. The policy would eventually be adopted by 17 hospitals across the Commonwealth of Virginia. By the end of the year, it would spread to 4 other states. By the next year, it would be the foundation for national reform. Across the city in Norfolk, in a windowless basement classroom at Norfolk Community College, Dr. Sterling taught CPR basics to 12 bored students who didn't know who he was or why a man in his 60s was instructing them on chest compressions for minimum wage. He earned $15.47 an hour. His medical license was permanently revoked. His wife had left. His attorney had advised him to relocate, to start over somewhere he wasn't recognized, but he hadn't. He stayed. He taught CPR to bored students. He ate lunch in that basement classroom every day, alone, scrolling through his cracked phone screen. The news coverage of Megan's ceremony appeared on that screen during his lunch break. He watched it. He watched Master Chief Stone saluting. He watched the colonel reading her citations. He watched former colleagues celebrating her, colleagues he'd spent years accumulating influence over, colleagues who were now smiling in photographs with the woman he'd tried to destroy. A student asked him once if he'd been a real doctor. He didn't answer. He simply closed his phone and stared at the concrete wall of the basement classroom until it was time to resume teaching people the mechanics of revival, the procedures for bringing people back from the edge of death, a task he was no longer permitted to perform in any official capacity. The irony was not lost on him. It never would be. Megan stood outside the VA hospital in Norfolk 3 weeks later. The same VA hospital where she'd sat 6 months ago, broken and desperate, a patient seeking therapy among the same haunted-eyed veterans she'd once treated. The building looked different now. Or maybe she looked different. Maybe both. She was a volunteer now. She led support groups for veterans transitioning to civilian medicine. The program was called From Combat to Care, and it was designed for people like her, people who'd survived combat medicine and were trying to figure out how to exist in a world where the stakes were theoretically lower but felt somehow higher. A young army medic with haunted eyes and trembling hands approached the door. His hands shook the way hers had once shaken. His eyes carried the weight of things he'd seen that couldn't be unseen. She held the door open for him, and when he met her gaze, she said the words that someone had needed to say to her years ago. I know exactly where you are. And I know the way through. He followed her inside. Behind them, the Norfolk morning continued, ordinary and indifferent, and somewhere across the city, in a basement classroom full of artificial torsos and CPR dummies, a man scrolled through videos of a woman he'd tried to erase, understanding finally that some people cannot be erased. Some people are too much themselves. Some people were always meant to be seen. If you've ever been underestimated and proven everyone wrong, if you've ever stayed quiet while being broken down and then risen anyway, subscribe for more stories like this. Share your experience in the comments below. Because the truth is this, not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding it all together.